Will this be the new state that requires wholesalers to hold a license in order to wholesale real estate? In today's video, I'm going to talk about a new state that recently reviewed and even passed a bill regarding wholesaling real estate and the way wholesalers should practice wholesaling real estate. Now, this particular state is a famous state, and this state, there are a lot of wholesalers, a lot of real estate investors, developers, and on top of that, there's a lot of real estate investors that have YouTube channels and Instagrams, and they're essentially the guru capital of real estate investing. And as many of you all probably already guessed, this state is the state of Arizona. Arizona just presented a new House Bill 2747 regarding wholesalers and how they should act and transact with either the seller or the end cash buyer. And we're going to drill into the bill right now so I can talk it over with you all if you don't understand the right verbiage and just what they're talking about. I'm going to completely in detail explain to you what's happening in this bill. Essentially, they want full disclosure from the wholesaler between them and the buyer, between them and the seller. On top of that, they want the seller and the buyer to have the right to cancel at any time for whatever reason. So even though someone may have signed a contract for a fair price for the property, everything is disclosed, that buyer, that seller still has the right just to leave that contract, which to me is a little bit iffy, you know? And I understand, like, even in regular real estate transactions on the MLS, even though you sign contracts, and if you really talk to your listing agent or the buyer's agent, you can in a way get out of that contract. But I mean, the buyer who's buying your house or the person selling your house can press charges, but that's just going to be a headache for them, going to cost them a lot of money. So a lot of people don't do that. So people back out of contracts all the time. But just the way this bill just made it so prevalent, like, hey, you know, make sure you have this stipulation. And I think it is important to have an inspection period, a cancellation period, even for the seller, right? If I put a property under contract between me and the seller, let's say something happens, you know, I think it's important for them to have that option, but to what degree? All right, so now let's drill into the computer. Let me show you all this bill and we can discuss it together. All right, you all, so I'm in my computer. I'm reviewing this HB 2747 bill that was sponsored by Representative Espinoza, right? And there was another representative who was a Republican. So you get both sides when you're passing these bills. You get the Republican side and the Democratic side. They both agreed, you know, so hooray, you know, we have some agreement in our country, in the House at least, between the Democrats and Republicans. But a lot of times you see that when these bills are passed. But yeah, let's just go right into it, right? Let's explain this. So let's just go to the first one. So the overview is to provide disclosure requirements for wholesale buyers and sellers. I think it's interesting that they just don't say wholesalers, they say wholesale buyers and then wholesale sellers. So wholesale buyers are the people who buy properties from the seller, right? That's between you and the seller. Like, we're wholesalers, and that covers us being buyers and sellers. Wholesale buyers are specifically between a wholesaler and a seller. Wholesale sellers are when I have a property under contract and I'm selling it to a cash buyer, right? They could have just put wholesalers, but they split it off between buyers and sellers, which I think is interesting. All right, so the provisions. This is what they are advocating for, wanting to pass, and there's been a lot of things happening with this bill, but it's going to get passed, right? But right now, they don't require a license. It's just full disclosures in these different things. So number one, it requires a wholesale buyer of residential real property before entering into a binding agreement to provide disclosure in writing to the seller that the buyer is a wholesale buyer. So maybe on top of the purchase and sales agreement, you have another agreement or disclosure page saying, hey, we are investors, we're looking to buy this flip or to buy this rental, but we are also wholesale buyers and we have the option to sell this contract to other people. And you can make that clear. I don't know if you have to verbally say it, you just have to put that as a disclosure. I don't know if people have to sign this disclosure or not. All right, so let's go down. So number two, it stipulates if a wholesale buyer violates the disclosure agreement, the seller may cancel the contract for sale at any time prior to the close of escrow without penalty and may retain any earnest money paid by the wholesale buyer. So obviously, if the wholesaler doesn't provide this disclosure, right, doesn't reveal that they're wholesaling a property, that seller can cancel out of this contract for any reason. And that's what I'm kind of alluding to. It wasn't just for any reason. It's like if a wholesaler doesn't disclose this requirement. Number 3, so it requires a wholesaler, so that's when you're selling the contract to your end buyer, to your cash buyer, before entering into a binding agreement with your cash buyer, to provide a disclosure in writing to the buyer that the seller is a wholesale seller who holds an equitable interest in the property and that the seller may not be able to convey title to the property. So this is essentially your assignment on contract. And that's what it says. It says, hey, I'm assigning this contract over to this person, right? And you're making a fee and you put your fee. But in that assignment of contract, now you have to put, hey, I'm not the actual seller. I don't hold title to this. I'm wholesaling this property. I'm assigning this property. I only have equitable interest. And most assignment contracts have that type of verbiage, but here in Arizona, they want to make that 100% clear to the different people. So number 4 stipulates if a wholesale seller violates the disclosure requirement, the buyer may cancel the contract. Okay, so same thing. If we as wholesalers don't disclose to our cash buyer that we're wholesaling to them a property that we don't own, we're just own equitable interest in it. If we don't disclose that, if there's no sort of disclosure in whatever they sign and whatever, then they can cancel at any time. All right, number 5 defines residential real property as real property with fewer than 5 dwelling units. So this is interesting. So it seems like they want wholesalers to only operate with properties that are 4 units or less. However, you can wholesale bigger properties, commercial buildings and multifamilies over that. So maybe I need to get more information about that, but what does that exactly mean? Define wholesale buyers as a person or entity that enters into a purchase contract for the residential real property as the buyer and assigns that same contract to another person or entity. So a wholesale buyer is the person between, it's the wholesaler and the seller. And it defines wholesaler as a person or entity that enters. So it's just explaining the 2 things that I already explained to you all. So that's essentially it. They mainly want full disclosure, right? They want in writing to the buyer that the seller is a wholesale seller that holds an equitable interest. They just want full disclosure, y'all. That's what they're looking for. Residential real property, and just a way of an escape for both a cash buyer and a motivated seller, that they can leave if they didn't know this particular person was wholesaling their property, and they can leave for whatever reason. And it seems like it's only residential real property means real property with fewer than 5 dwelling units. So I don't know if they're trying to stop people from wholesaling commercial buildings or multifamilies, but yeah, that's essentially it. So let me know what you all think of this new House Bill 2747 from Arizona. It's just crazy that this state, where the majority of these wholesalers are and these gurus, that they're implementing laws like this. And this is just the start. And whenever a state or city or county introduce something like this, usually it leads to licensing in the future. So what are you all going to do in the future regarding these type of bills in your city or in your state? Are you going to get your license? Are you just going to flip properties and just transition to rental properties? What are you going to do? What pivots are you making in your business right now, especially if you're in these states? All right, you all, if you all have any questions, let me know down below. Make sure you like, subscribe, and I'll talk to you all later.